Morning, guys. Go ahead and break out your gear. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the actual presidency. Instead of the powers of the presidency, we're going to talk a little bit more about the other people surrounding the president on a daily basis, and then some of the traditions and the rules that have governed the presidency over the years. All right, so let's get going. So, as always, you guys pause me when you need me to. Um, Ordinarily, this would take a lot longer. We'd be having much more of a conversation, but today I'm just going to puke out a bunch of stuff here, and you guys get to writing. All right. So first things first. If we're talking about some of the important members of the White House organization beyond the president, near the top of the list, you have to put the vice president. Um, if you read through the Constitution, it doesn't give a whole lot of power to the vice presidency at all. FDR's One of FDR's vice presidents, his name was John Nance Garner, compared the vice presidency to a bucket of warm spit. Okay, at least that's the cleaned up version. You can feel free to Google it, and you'll get the real unvarnished, salty version of that quote. But in any case, um, basically as vice president, number one, you are waiting around for the president to die. Okay, that's you're the president's understudy, I suppose you could say. Um, Beyond that, your other major power is that you show up in the Senate. Remember, the Senate has 100 members, so there's always a possibility of a what? A tie. And so, as vice president, your job is to show up and break that tie. Other than that, constitutionally speaking, you really don't have any power. But typically, presidents will give the vice president, all sorts of other tasks to do. Attend funerals in other countries for, other heads of state. Um, Joe Biden, was famously tasked with essentially overseeing the stimulus package back in 2008, 2009 during the Great Recession. Right now, Mike Pence. All right, Mike Pence is in charge essentially of the coronavirus task force. And so, you may not be given a whole lot of official duties, but unofficially speaking, presidents will typically give you a laundry list of jobs to do. From there, you move into the White House office. These are people that are hired and fired at the president's will. They don't need to be confirmed by the Senate, once they've been appointed. The chief of staff basically functions as the president's gatekeeper. Your job is to organize the president's, essentially his day-to-day activities. Um, Generally speaking, in most White Houses, most well-organized, well-run White Houses, the chief of staff is the person you need to get to if you want to get to the president. And so in that sense, you've got an awful lot of influence over government policy. You can shield the president from certain people. You could allow other people to have more influence over the president, and so it's a seriously important, powerful position. On top of that, you also have the press secretary. All right, the press secretary in most White Houses will give daily briefings under ordinary circumstances, and your job is to basically communicate the president's message to the rest of the country. The Like I said, neither of these two people need to be confirmed by the Senate. They can be hired and fired at will. President Trump has gone through, I think he's gone through four different press secretaries at this point. His last one, Stephanie Grisham, didn't give any press conferences at all. Um, and I'm trying to think how many chiefs of staff the president has gone through. It's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 as well. These are high pressure uh, jobs, and so typically these people have kind of a short lifespan. By the way, on an aside, you guys, if you're looking for something to watch, I would seriously recommend The West Wing. Okay, the first season, especially the first, I'd say 10 episodes, each one of them deals with a topic that you guys are likely to encounter on the AP test. So if you're looking for something to do and you want to watch some compelling television, I would totally recommend that. Okay. Um, from there, you've got the executive office of the president. This organization is pretty much staffed by experts, okay? Experts in different areas of government policy. The first one is the NSC. The NSC stands for National Security Council. These people essentially deal with foreign policy and military policy. You've got the vice president. The National Security Advisor is on that staff. The Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, along with a whole host of other unnamed anonymous experts in foreign policy. All right, and they're there to help the president make those kinds of decisions. The National Security Advisor, just as an example, the sort of famous or infamous story is that in the Obama administration, hi Cole, the Obama administration, his national security advisor was the first person he saw every morning. Okay, outside of like Michelle. Okay, I mean he would wake up, and within 5 minutes of being awake, he was receiving a briefing from the national security advisor, basically telling him about everything that happened around the globe while he slept. So, essentially that organization deals with those specific topics: foreign policy, military policy, diplomacy, those sorts of things. Then the second one is the OMB. The OMB is the Office of Management and Budget. The OMB's job is to basically prepare the president's annual budget every year. Okay, the president submits a budget to Congress, and the OMB's job is one of its major jobs is to prepare that budget. That's the B in OMB. The M part, okay, the management part, the OMB's second major job is to monitor and oversee government spending. Okay, so if Congress, let's say, passes a law that allocates, I don't know, let's say $3 trillion for coronavirus mitigation, the OMB's job is to, over the next several months and over the next several years, to monitor how that money has been spent. Okay, whether it's actually been spent on worthwhile ventures or whether it's been spent on useless stuff that isn't going to see any kind of results. All right, so OMB deals with fiscal issues, and then National Security Council deals, of course, with foreign policy. Then you've got the cabinet. We're going to talk more about the cabinet next week when we get to the bureaucracy, but currently there are 15 different cabinet departments. So these are the different secretaries: Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Transportation, etc. These folks are appointed by the president, and they have to be confirmed by the Senate in order to get their jobs. Oftentimes these folks, they ordinarily have they're experts in their particular field, and they've got a particular loyalty to their issue. And oftentimes what this does is it results in a system of divided loyalties, where on the one hand, they're loyal to the president because the president gave them their job, and they typically want to keep that job. And then secondly, they're loyal to their particular area of government policy. If you're Secretary of Education, chances are, in most cases, you've got a background in public education. Right? That's not the case with the current Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. But ordinarily, you've got a background in public education. You're a teacher, or you were a high school administrator at some point. You're loyal to public education. It's near and dear to your heart. And so, if the president, proposes a spending reduction for public education, for public schools, you're probably going to push back on that a little bit. So your loyalties, might be split between the person who gave you the job and your desire to benefit your particular area of government policy. All right, we'll talk more about the cabinet next week. Lastly, we need to spend a little bit of time with some of the ground rules for the presidency. We know that presidents are limited to 2 terms. For most of the country's history, that was by tradition. Okay, Washington established that, way back in the late 1700s. And since then, pretty much every president stuck to that until one blew it out of the water. And hopefully you guys are thinking of who I'm thinking of. And I'm thinking of Franklin Roosevelt, 4 terms. He didn't make it very far into his 4th term, but still was elected 4 times. First because of the Great Depression, and then because of World War II. But by the time of Roosevelt's death, there was some real concern, not just among Republicans, but among Democrats as well, that Okay, Roosevelt seemed to be doing a pretty good job. After all, he was elected 4 times. But Congress and folks around the country really felt that, particularly Republicans, but also a large number of Democrats, felt that you needed to rein this in. Okay, and so by 1951, we get the 22nd Amendment. This one is likely to show up next month on the test. 22nd Amendment limits the president to two 4-year terms or a maximum of 10 years total. Okay, and you get to 10 years uh, if you, as vice president, take over 2 years of the president's term if he dies, and then from there you wind up running for 2 terms of your own. Jump ahead, you guys, to the 25th Amendment, presidential disability. Let's say the president falls off the roof putting up Christmas lights and, has a brain injury but insists that he can still do the job. This is where the 25th Amendment kicks in. Okay, passed in 1967. This was meant to deal with presidents who were disabled. And in this particular case, the president could be removed from office if the cabinet, along with the vice president, decide amongst themselves that the president is unable to do the job, and so the president can be removed from office here. Okay, this came. I mean, there were a lot of situations. Woodrow Wilson, you guys may or may not remember, had a stroke after he got back from Europe after World War One. Who else? Eisenhower had a heart attack. And so this was meant to deal with those kinds of situations. The line of succession, this is probably trivia. I don't expect to see this on the test, but basically you go from the vice president. The next person in line is the Speaker of the House. The next person after that is the Senate. In the Senate, the President pro tempore, or the President pro tem. And then after the President pro tem, you go essentially down the line through all the different cabinet departments in the order that those cabinet departments were created. Okay, like I said, I don't expect to see it on the test. It's just a little bit of trivia. And then the last thing we need to talk about is impeachment. All right, so we've already talked about this as a country for a year now, but when we talk about impeachment, it's a 2-step process. First, you need to decide what is an impeachable offense, and the 3 are right there. Okay, bribery, treason, or high crimes and misdemeanors. And bribery and treason are usually a little bit easier to define. We, of course, know that high crimes are trickier, okay, because there's no real guidance as to what constitutes a high crime. So in this particular case, the House of Representatives is the first part to act. They draft articles of impeachment, and they vote. They decide whether or not to actually impeach the president. Okay, after, in some cases, well, we saw this in the fall, weeks of testimony and hearings, and a mountain of evidence, then the House of Representatives decides ultimately whether or not to impeach. Okay, and it takes a simple majority, which is what the Democrats had in the House of Reps, and so they voted to impeach the president back in God, what would that have been? October? No, November. I think November. From there, it moves over to the Senate. Okay, the Senate, you need 2/3 of the Senate in order to convict. And so we saw that this year in January that the Senate held its hearings and its votes and did not have 2/3 of the Senate voting to convict, and so therefore the president continued to be president. It's pretty darn rare, partly because of those high bars that you need to convict, that super majority. It's disruptive. Okay, everybody in government and around the country knows that it sucks all the oxygen out of the room, and so typically it winds up being very, very rare indeed to a situation. All right, next week, probably Monday, we will talk about the bureaucracy. We'll start in with all those different government agencies that help the president do his job. All right, thank you guys for playing along. Happy Aloha Friday.